America is not spending every single day training to go to war with Russia. That's a good thing. I think the big difference between back then and today, though, is when we were training to fight the Soviet Union, we respected the Soviet Union. We even feared the Soviet Union. And that's a different mindset than exists today. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States viewed Russia as a defeated enemy. And I think anybody who lived through the decade of the 1990s knows what that meant. We sought to destroy Russia, sought to control you politically, and we sought to exploit you economically. We were not afraid of Russia anymore. Now, when Boris Yeltsin stepped aside and Vladimir Putin took over, that changed the dynamic somewhat. Because now Russia had a leader that wasn't going to allow Russia to be treated as a defeated enemy. He was going to get Russia to stand up on its own 2 feet. But the fact is, Russia was very weak when Vladimir Putin took over, and Russia was weak for many years afterwards. And we took advantage of that. For instance, the expansion of NATO was a sign of Russian weakness. The interference of the United States and other nations in Russia's internal affairs, for instance, our desire to control the political opposition of Russia, meant we didn't respect Russia. We kept saying we want Russia to be a democratic society, but you can't be a democratic society when the opposition is controlled by foreign powers. So what we have today is the United States continuing to act as if Russia is weak, to continuing to act as if we are the dominant power. And we have Russia finally standing up on its own 2 feet, strong, independent, and saying enough is enough. But so the conflict in Ukraine, it's a horrible tragedy, first of all. I don't want to minimize it. The death and destruction is beyond imagination, but it's not the same as the Cold War. At the Cold War, we were training every day to kill the Soviets. Today, we're using the Ukrainians as a proxy for this purpose. One of the reasons why this is because we're starting to fear you. We're starting to respect you. And, as a result, we're not willing to fight you. So we use others to fight. And you can thank one person for that, Vladimir Putin. The Cold War was driven by ideological conflict. But you need to understand, when the Cold War started, the Soviet Union was a very strong power. We didn't control them, we confronted them. There's a difference between that scenario and what exists today regarding Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the decision makers in Washington, D.C. decided that they can never let Russia rise up to replicate the power of the Soviet Union ever again. If you look at the decade of the 90s, America was seeking to destroy Russia. America sought to destroy Russia economically. I don't know the exact numbers, but over $20 trillion worth of Russian wealth were taken out of the country by this capitalism that people talk about. And we sought to control Russia politically. We owned your president. President Yeltsin was owned by the United States. The proof, the 1996 election, we bought it for him. If you look at the experts today in the United States, Michael McFaul, for instance, a name that should be well known to Russians, the former ambassador, Fiona Hill, and others. These are people who came into intellectual prominence during the 1990s. People like myself, Roland LaJoy, who was my general when I was doing inspections, and all the other officers that were there, we studied the Soviet Union. I've told you we were your enemy, but we studied you because we believed that you have to know your enemy. You have to understand your enemy. Michael McFaul and Fiona Hill don't study Russia. They don't want to know Russia. Their whole approach was how to dominate Russia, how to exploit Russia, and there's a difference. So when Vladimir Putin stood Russia up on its feet, what happened wasn't an ideological conflict. There was resentment, there was anger, there was frustration that we had Russia where we wanted them for 10 years in the 1990s, and suddenly Russia has slipped away. And so now the goal is to get Russia to come back to where they were in the 1990s. That's the policy of the United States, to get Russia to stop being this strong, independent country, and to get Russia to come back and be sort of a colonial, servant of the American hegemon. And the United States has viewed the expansion of NATO, in particular the expansion of NATO into Ukraine, and Georgia as a key element of weakening Russia, to create a weak Russia that we can then tear them down and take control of. And so that's where we are today. Is the United States behind what Ukraine is doing? Absolutely. Our goal is the strategic defeat of Russia. Our control of Ukraine is absolute. Understand this. If the United States stopped supporting Ukraine today, the war would end tomorrow. The question, was the United States behind the drone attack on the Kremlin? We may not have ordered it, but we facilitated it. We made it happen because of our support of the Ukrainian government. I've returned to Russia. I haven't been in Russia for over 30 years. And one of the reasons why I came on this tour, why I was invited to come on this tour, was to see firsthand, without prejudice, the reality of Russia today. In the United States, there's this notion that Russia is weak, that Russia is teetering on the brink of disaster. The United States, in working with the Ukrainians, they have a strategic plan of creating a Moscow Maidan. That's their goal. To put pressure on Russia through economic sanctions, by enabling the Ukrainians to hurt Russia militarily in Ukraine. The combined effect is designed to reduce confidence in the Russian government and generate domestic political unrest so that there could be an uprising in Moscow that could remove Vladimir Putin from power. That's the strategic objective. Now, I've only been here for a few days. I have many more days to go, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. I think I should, at this point in time, thank Alexander Zyrionov for allowing me to come here. I think all of Russia should thank him, to be honest, because this has been a fantastic opportunity to learn, to see, and I plan on taking this back to the United States in an effort to change the attitude of the American people. But I'll tell you a couple things that I've noticed so far. If America thinks the sanctions is going to break the Russian economy, they're sadly mistaken. What I've seen so far is a vibrant Russian economy. It may not be perfect, but it's vibrant, it's growing, it's not shrinking. And I also see a people who love their country. It's not a shallow love. It's not it's not what in America we would call the sunshine soldier, somebody who only is patriotic when the sun is shining. You see the spirit of the Russian people everywhere. Even in Moscow, when I was in St. Petersburg, when I was in Irkutsk, when I was in Novosibirsk, everybody is focused on Victory Day, and that shows the appreciation that the Russian people have for those who served their country, for those who saved their country. This is important because you have to ask yourself, what is it they're trying to save? Why would they sacrifice so much? Because history shows that when armies are called to make the ultimate sacrifice, if they don't believe in what they're sacrificing their lives for, they often opt to drop their guns and run. But these guys were fighting for the Russia of Tolstoy, the Russian of Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Chekhov. They were fighting for the Russian of Lenin, the Russian of Stalin. They were fighting for the beautiful black lacquer boxes that capture the art. They were fighting for Ayazovsky, the painter. They were fighting for the soil. They were fighting for Russia and the Russian soul. And that's what I'm going to tell the Americans, is that you can't defeat the Russian soul. You shouldn't fear the Russian soul. You should want to be friends with the Russian soul. And that's the important thing. In America right now, we have Russophobia. It's a disease that's destroying our relationship. My goal is to create a vaccine for this disease by introducing the American people, or reintroducing the American people, to the Russian soul, so they're not afraid of it. They actually would want to become friends with it.
In addition to that, Japan's economy is 2.5 times the size of South Korea. So if you're sitting just north of Korea in Siberia, where you have very few Russians and a lot of people who aren't Russians, you're probably worried. And you see North Korea is somewhat useful because it can somehow or another provide you with some insurance against encroachment by Japan. But we have nothing to fear of North Korea. Its nuclear program is very dubious. The claims made for it are dubious. There's not much there. South Korea knows that. China knows that. So if you're sitting in Beijing, you're sitting in Seoul and Tokyo, all three of those capitals can agree on one thing: no war. No one wants one. It's bad for business. They want to get on with things. President Xi has made it very clear to President Kim that he needs to do business with us and with Seoul. President Xi would like Seoul to become responsible for the disaster in North Korea, manage it to extinction. They don't want millions of starving North Koreans throwing themselves into Manchuria. And by the way, President Xi has just finished a brilliant wall of barriers for 1,100 miles between the border of Manchuria and North Korea for that very reason. Doesn't want it. He's not going to allow it to happen to him what we've allowed to happen to us. So he's down the wall. Absolutely.
But the North Korean didn't pay for it.
No, they didn't pay for it. But in effect, they, in a kind of a strange way, because they've been under tough sanctions, perhaps they have, but that's neither here nor there. The issue is that there's an opportunity to end this mess on the Korean Peninsula, to sign an end of war agreement. That's what President Trump needs to do with President Xi and the Korean leaders. Secondly, turn the operational control of the peninsula militarily over to President Moon. Okay. And then schedule the withdrawal of our forces from South Korea to match the dismantling of the nuclear capability, whatever it is in North Korea. That's it. It's over. The war is over. South Korea won, North Korea lost, time for us to leave. The Japanese, I'm sure some of your listeners know that when President Trump was in Japan, he said, I don't understand this. Japan is an immensely wealthy, successful country. They don't need our help to defend themselves. And what is this treaty we have under which we come to their aid, but they don't come to ours? Well, these are things that are legacies from the Cold War. None of these things make any sense. Even if we move to Europe and we look at Russia right now, Russia is in no position to field massive armies with the goal of invading Eastern Europe. Look, if Putin wanted to do such a thing, and he had the capability, I suppose he would have done it already in Ukraine. It hasn't happened. Because frankly, killing Orthodox Ukrainians is not very popular in Orthodox Russia. Ukrainians are brothers under the skin. This is not quite a civil war, but it might as well be, so why would we want to do that? So I think it's time for us to step back from this entire world structure that everyone worships as the international liberal order, and understand, first of all, it doesn't make a lot of sense anymore because the interests that underpinned it no longer exist. And instead of seeing this as something bad, we should look at the recovery of the world since World War II as an essentially positive thing. Mm-hmm. And if we want to pat ourselves on the back, then let's congratulate ourselves on the restoration of health, the restoration of healthy countries, of great powers in a multipolar system, and stop pretending that it's a unipolar moment or a bipolar fight with China or anything else. It's not. Japan is an immensely powerful country, and if the Chinese became truly aggressive, which they are not militarily at all, they would have to deal with Japan, and they know that. And no one wants to.
So you don't buy the idea of this sort of existential threat posed by this rising, boisterous, aggressive China?
Everyone in Asia looks with great fear and suspicion on China. Chinese are not popular in Asia. They're seen as a sort of parasitic element that moves into their societies, tries to take over, absorb their capital, and so forth. China has no friends on its periphery. Everyone on its periphery is appalled and afraid of China. Why should we join this? We don't need to.
Mm-hmm. Some people, okay, of course, South China Sea, it's considered by many, look at that. This is what they're doing. That's kind of an appetizer for other things to come.
Well, then make the same comment about Vietnam. Vietnam is militarized as many sandbars and islands as the Japanese have. Then condemn Taiwan, which is engaged in exactly the same thing. The claims made by Taiwan and China are indistinguishable. By the way, we don't know how the next election will turn out in Taiwan, but the KMT could conceivably win, and they're talking about peaceful reunification with China. Then look at the Filipinos. The Filipinos are unhappy with some of the things the Chinese do, but every time they appeal to Beijing, Beijing backs off and makes arrangements and accommodates them. Again, the Chinese need access to the South China Sea more than anybody else. The notion that they would block it is absurd.
Yes.
They have never stopped a commercial ship.